Federal Fag and Alex Reynolds Mystery Series Book 2. Author Fred Hunter. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York, 1998. Narrator Eric Ost. For Raymond Dragon. Chapter 17. At first, I was aware of only a low mumbling that seemed to come from inside my head. I had the sensation of being underwater without being wet. When I tried to raise my arms, they wouldn't move. I was tied to something. Other voices began to intermingle with the mumbling, which I suddenly realized was coming from me. It took an effort to stop. At first, I was afraid that I'd been doing loudly, but as the other voices became clearer, I was relieved to find that they hadn't noticed. As my awareness grew, a wave of pain washed over me from the knot on my head where I'd been hit. "I told you they'd come here. Didn't I tell you they'd come here?" said a slightly familiar and very excited voice through the painful fog that seemed to have drifted between my ears. My head lolled sideways at the same time. I realized it would probably be better if I didn't move. Not knowing the situation yet, I wanted to keep as still as possible in hopes I'd be able to pick up something from whoever was talking. I did manage to sneak a stealthy peek at as much as I could of my surroundings without moving my head. I was sure that I was on the black blank set. "I've seen this movie before," came into my head, and for one panicked moment I thought I'd said it aloud. But the voices went on without a beat. "Didn't I tell you they'd come here?" "Yeah, you told me," came the rumbling growl that I readily recognized as belonging to Derek Holmes. This made me wonder at once why we were tied up, given that Holmes worked for the FBI. Then again, presumably, he didn't know who was where and we were on the same side, or a different faction of the same side. It also came to me in a fragmented memory that one of the last things I'd seen before being conked on the head was Willie Marino walking out of the room. It was entirely possible that he'd come back. Worse yet, it was possible that we hadn't been as clever as we thought in hiding behind the set, and Marino had spotted us. In that case, he was probably the one who attacked us. Either way, I was afraid we'd inadvertently put Holmes in the position of having to play out whatever role was necessary to maintain his cover as a pornographer and mob pawn. I couldn't imagine that he'd be happy with our blunder, and I didn't want to imagine what was going to happen next. "I done good for you, didn't I?" said the excited voice. "Yeah, you did." "Well," the voice hesitated. "Well, do you think I could have some stuff now?" There was a marked hesitation on the part of Holmes. Then he said with a curious tone in his voice, Sure, in a little while." Peter chose that moment to groan. I wasn't happy that he was hurt, but I was sure happy to know he was alive. "Ah, they're coming back to us," Holmes rumbled. Said Peter. "It's all right," I said quietly in his direction. I slewed my eyes sideways and saw that Peter was next to me, tied to an uncomfortable wooden chair. I raised my head and found myself face to face over the expanse of the floor with Derek Holmes. He was dressed in a Hawaiian shirt and tan shorts that revealed cascades of body hair, which made him look like a tourist from the Planet of the Apes. Beside him, on a tall canvas director's chair, sat Willie Marino. Oh, God, I thought we'd made things worse for Holmes, and for ourselves. Then I'd even supposed Marino's presence explained why Holmes had to tie us up. Marino sat with one serge-suited leg crossed over the other, his large hands resting on the arms of the chair, which looked like it would buckle beneath them. Another figure hovered in the background, in the darkness behind the video cameras. Marino looked past us as he spoke to Holmes, giving the impression that none of the occupants of the room were of any significance to him. "Like I said, we're not happy with the way things are going with your company here. It may be time for us to sever relations." Holmes looked neither scared nor impressed. "I told you I'll take care of it. I can handle this. I'll find out who these guys are and what they're doing here. Then I'll take care of them. That should prove to your boys that I'm reliable." Marino said nothing but moved his head ever so slightly in Holmes's direction. I realized right away that Holmes had made a fatal error. Marino had seen us at the pretty party. He knew something was wrong. "Leave them to me, and I'll take care of them," said Holmes, oblivious to the recognition from Marino. Marino sat silently for a moment, then slid one leg from the other and slipped off the chair. "Sure," he said, without expression. "You do that." Marino left the stage in the same direction as he'd exited when we were watching from behind the set. Holmes continued to stare at us for a moment and seemed to be waiting for something, which he heard. A door opened and closed from the direction in which Marino had gone. Holmes didn't smile. "Is he gone?" said the figure that was still hidden by the darkness behind the cameras. "Mm-hmm." "Are they awake?" "Come and see. Come on." Holmes beckoned as if talking to a child. The figure stepped into the light. To my astonishment, it was Jeff Durkin. "I told you they would come here, didn't I? They asked about Willie. They asked about Admiral General Distributors, and I knew they'd end up here." He sounded just like an over-anxious puppy. "Mm-hmm," said Holmes noncommittally. "I did good, didn't I?" Holmes didn't look at Durkin, but I got the impression that he felt Durkin was more like a gnat than a dog. "You did right," he said after a pause that anyone with unaltered senses would have realized was a cue to shut up. Jeff Durkin didn't take it that way. "So can I have some stuff now?" he said a little more pathetically. Holmes finally looked at him. "I said later." Even Durkin got the message that time. He dropped cross-legged on the floor next to the director's chair, for all the world as if awaiting the bidding of his master. If one of my arms had been untied, I would have hit myself in the forehead. That perpetual vacant expression of Durkin's was chemically induced, and even though I'd thought he was high at the party, I hadn't realized he was hooked. Holmes stepped over to the director's chair and lifted himself into it as if it were a throne, never removing his eyes from us. He crossed his legs in a curiously feminine way that I was sure would give him rug burns with all that hair. He folded his hands in his laps and sighed. "So, what am I going to do with you?" "We could make a movie," I said, unable to disguise the sneer in my voice. I couldn't help it, even if this jerk was working for something the feds considered the greater good. I couldn't get past the fact that he was using my people to do it. "I don't make snuff films," he rumbled without expression. God knows this startled me. I didn't know how far he was going to play this, or exactly what part Durkin had in this little drama. I figured that probably Holmes couldn't drop his cover as long as Durkin was around, but I wasn't sure. I thought it best to find out. "So," I said with a nod toward Durkin, "does he work for the same people you do?" "Hmm?" said Holmes with a muffled snort. He reached down and stroked Jeff's hair once or twice. "No, he just does little jobs for me, like keeping tabs on people I need to know about. Like you." I glanced down at Durkin, but the scorn on my face went unnoticed. Durkin's slightly sweaty face was turned up expectantly at Holmes, who didn't bother to return the attention. "Don't get me wrong, he doesn't follow people. My little Jeff isn't quite smart enough for that, I don't think. No, he just reports to me what he hears. When you started asking questions about Patrick Gleason, little Jeff here came straight to me, and he carries out some errands on occasion, for little considerations." "Like parts in your movies, so he gets fucked over both ways?" Something resembling a smile fought its way through the fuzz on Holmes's face. "No, he gets paid for his performances. He gets little presents for keeping an eye on people, don't you, Jeff?" Holmes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white packet. "Like this." At the sight of the packet, Durkin perked up immediately, and he seemed to sweat more profusely. It was a pathetic sight. Holmes, holding the packet above the hopeless young man, held at abeyance like a dog with a biscuit on its nose, waiting for the signal to snatch it up. "He'll do a lot for this," Holmes added needlessly. I tried to hide my disgust. "So in addition to making porno movies, you're supplying drugs." "Oh, I don't supply the drugs. My associates do." "To you," I said angrily, "but you supply them to him." "I don't charge him," said Holmes with a shrug, and With this, he dropped the packet, which Durkin caught and tore open greedily. He pulled a thin tube out of his pocket, stuck it into the packet, and inhaled. I managed to spare a thought for how foolishly I tried to give him words of wisdom. Like Patrick, this guy was beyond hope. My batting average was unimproved. I didn't much watch Jeff after that. Jesus, said Peter under his breath. I was glad to hear he'd come around enough to realize what was going on around him. Look, I said to Holmes, still trying to keep from saying directly what I was talking about for fear of arousing Durkin's interest. After all, Durkin knew Willie Marino, and I no longer entertained any sort of hope that Durkin was redeemable. I was sure he'd go straight to Marino if he had information he could barter. He couldn't help himself. Look, I know who you are. Everybody knows who Derek is, said Durkins unexpectedly. He appeared to be calming down considerably. I mean, I said more pointedly, I know who you are. There was another rumble from within Holmes's mammoth beard. I knew he was smiling somewhere in there. And I know who you are, he said mockingly. You're with the CIA. Oh, I glanced down at Durkin, who was singularly unimpressed. He was too busy taking care of his other nostril. If you knew we were with the CIA, said Peter indignantly, then what the hell was that audition of mine all about? Why the hell didn't you just talk to me? Holmes replied evenly. I wanted to see how far you would go. We're all trained never to blow our cover. I wanted to see if you'd take my dick up your ass to keep yours. That would have been sweet. I would have fucked the shit out of you if your mother hadn't shown up. So that's why he'd sounded so amused. He'd known who Peter was all the time. Waves of disgust washed over me. A lot of us feel like we're being screwed by the government. Holmes acted like he thought it was his right to make it literal. How long have you known who we were? I said, trying to dispel the visual images Holmes had caused. He let out a snort. You know how long. What I don't know is how you got on to me. These words hung there in the dusty, fan-swept air of the warehouse, like a slowly blinking sign in a liquor store windows. How you got on to me. How you got on to me. The only reply I could think of was, what? Holmes didn't move. I should have known the minute your friend showed up and said he'd been talking to the CIA that it was all over, but I thought maybe if I got rid of him, everything would be all right, at least for a while. There was another silence. I managed to say, what? Again, from somewhere in the stupor, I felt descending into my pounding brain. Alex, said Peter warningly. I could tell by his tone that he was now wide awake and probably about 5 minutes ahead of me in figuring out what we were hearing. I should have known, Holmes repeated wistfully, that once you guys got on to me, everything was over. I should have gotten out then. Why didn't you? Said Peter suddenly. There was a little snort from the beard. Because Malibu has a way of getting into your skin. You got that right, said Durkin dreamily. As always, I found it really irritating that Peter had figured out something and left me behind. I sounded petulant when I said, would somebody please explain to me what you're talking about? Peter turned to me and I saw his face for the first time. The muscles were tight. He too was experiencing a great deal of pain from where he'd been hit on the head. He sighed in an attempt to relieve it. He thought Patrick was talking to the CIA. He severed their connection. I looked at Holmes, whose lack of expression almost made my circulatory system grind to a halt. I realized at that moment that this guy had murdered my old friend and Brett Lover, and that he looked about as remorseful as John Wayne Gacy in a clown suit, and he had us tied up. You killed Patrick, I said impotently. Why? Holmes gave an appreciative, They trained you really well, he said. I could almost believe you don't know, but I know better. I looked at Peter, who was staring at Holmes fixedly. Peter said, my guess would be that Holmes killed Patrick because he thought Patrick was our connection to him. The CIA investigation, I said slowly. He thought we were part of the CIA investigation? Mm-hmm. Then it was beginning to come to me, and I felt like the Class A clod I was. The CIA investigation. The investigation we were endangering and that Larry Nelson was working on. They were investigating Derek Holmes. Bingo, said Peter, a rueful smile in his voice. He'd noticed the look on my face and knew I'd figured it out. It was slick, said Holmes, the way he dropped the CIA into the conversation when we were filming. Really slick. But I don't know what you hope to accomplish. I could feel bile running down my stomach. Nausea churned around down there and threatened to slip back up to my throat. It had all been a mistake. It had all been a really stupid mistake that had snowballed and cost Patrick his life. We weren't trying to accomplish anything. We weren't here to investigate you. We were trying to get Patrick out of porno movies. That was all. Patrick was an old friend of mine. Sure, said Holmes. Why would the CIA be investigating you? Said Peter. I know you know about the money. There's no use denying it. Why else would you have been here tonight? The money? I glanced at Peter, and from the look he shot back from the corner of his eyes, I could see he had no idea what the director was talking about either. The first we had heard or seen of any money was that briefcase that had changed hands earlier. Except, oh, God. Another thought came to me, and I shoved it down. I didn't want any sign of recognition to escape to my face. So you killed Patrick, and you killed Brett Lover? There was a slight nod. But why? Because he was going to talk to you. We tried to get rid of you, or at least warn you. In the car when we left your party, I said. There was another nod. We, said Peter. One of my associates and my little friend here, Holmes replied with a gesture toward Durkin. Oh man, that was a blast, said Durkin airily, rocking back and forth on his butt like a happy child. He closed his eyes and seemed to lose himself in a world of his own. Or maybe he was just reliving the fun of almost killing us. So what are you going to do now? Sever the remaining connections, Holmes replied with a frightening lack of emotion. The two of you and your mother. There was an electrified pause before he added, By the way, where is your mother? I could feel myself going pale. I have no idea. You don't think I'd bring her to a place like this, do you? Not if she was really your mother. Then again, it doesn't much matter who she is. I'll take care of her soon enough. My mind frantically raced for something that might buy us some time, and it suddenly lit on Goldfinger. What good would killing us do? You know if we disappear, all hell will come down on you. You'll never get away. That's where you're wrong, said Holmes. And I thought I could detect something of a smile once again, finding its way out through the brush around his mouth. There will be a pause, however, brief in the proceedings. What do you mean? It will take them a little time to realize they've lost you and to send somebody else out. That pause will give me the window of opportunity I need to get out of the country. Even if it's only a little window, killing you will buy me the time I need. So he didn't know about Nelson, who would know we were gone pretty damn quick, and he didn't know Nelson was really the one investigating him. But that didn't matter. Holmes believed we were his immediate problem. Even if I told him about Nelson now, I was sure he wouldn't believe me, and if he did believe me, I'd just be signing Nelson's death warrant, which, like him or not, I wasn't prepared to do. I decided that if we were going to be killed, I wasn't going to make it easy on this prick. I calmed myself and attempted to avoid my face of expression. You're wrong about buying yourself time, I said confidently. There was a slight hesitation. What do you mean? I tried my best to sound like an authentic agent instead of like an overpaid government delivery fag. The CIA may take a while to realize we're gone, but you'll never get out of the country. What's going to stop me? I paused for effect and said, Willie Marino. Holmes paused, but not for effect. His expression didn't change, but the beat before he responded told me that I'd hit the mark. What do you mean? You made a mistake, I said, attempting a superior smile. Earlier, just before he left, you made a mistake, and Marino noticed it. I saw him do it. Didn't you, Peter? I sure did, Peter replied with an air of confidence that surprised me, since I was pretty sure he didn't have a clue what I was talking about. What? Said Holmes, his gravelly voice tinged with harshness. You told him you'd find out who we are. You acted like you didn't know us, but he knew that wasn't true. He's seen us before. There was a silence during which the director appeared to be running through his memory. After a few moments, the negligible bit of his face that wasn't covered with hair grew white, then flushed red. The party, he said. That's right. Willie was at the party, Durkin chimed in, still rocking back and forth. He was at the party in that beautiful silk suit. God, I wish he was gay. I'd throw my legs over my head for him. Shut up, Holmes snapped. Durkin complied, but continued to rock and smile. Holmes slid a gun from behind his back, apparently having had it tucked inside his belt. There were small beads of sweat forming over his brows. It can all be explained, he said more to himself than to us. I can explain it away. I can say I was keeping an eye on you myself. But he knows you lied, I said evenly. As if adding an exclamation point to what I just said, a door closed at the far end of the warehouse. Not a slam, mind you, but just loudly enough to let anyone within earshot know that whoever had come in didn't particularly care whether or not he was heard. Holmes's head snapped in the direction of the sound, and he raised his gun like a vice cop. You stay here and watch them, he said to Durkin with quiet anxiety. Jeff didn't give any sign of having heard him. Holmes carefully moved to the first aisle, at the opposite side from the one we'd used. Staying close to the wall, he started down the aisle, quickly disappearing from our view. Peter and I watched the corner of the shelves until we had some hope that he was far enough away that we could whisper without being heard. I glanced at Peter, then turned to Durkin and said, Jeff, untie us! Eyes closed, Jeff began to hum. For Christ's sake, Jeff, untie us! Durkin's lips parted, and a gust of breath escaped him. It makes me, he sang off key, but keeping somewhat to a tune I remembered as, when it says Libby, Libby, Libby on the label. Jeff, snap out of it, said Peter as sharply as he could without raising his voice. I love it, he continued to sing as he slipped his right hand down the front of his pants. Oh man, it do feel good. God, what are we going to do? I said to Peter. What would Indiana Jones do in a situation like this? I almost laughed. I can't imagine him being held prisoner by a drugged-out idiot playing with himself. I turned back to Jeff to try again. You don't know what a mess we're in. I mean, what a mess you're in. It feels good. Jeff, please try to understand what I'm saying. His eyes suddenly popped open and he said dreamily, I understand you, man. No, you don't, I said frantically. Your friend, Derek Holmes, works for the FBI. Or he did. He's done something to screw them over. Oh, yeah, he's good, sang Jeff. He slowly got to his feet and, still keeping the tune going, pulled down the zipper on his shorts. And he's screwed over the mob at the same time. And you're in the middle of it. Don't you get it? If you don't untie us so the three of us can get out of here and get help, either Holmes or his mob boss is going to kill us. Durkin's eyes closed again as he slid his shorts down and began stroking himself. You worry. Don't worry. Jeff, please, I implored. Oh, I don't believe this, said Peter with exasperation. We're going to be executed in front of a peep show. I can just see these headlines. This is hardly the time to worry about what people will think. Jeff, Durkin swayed left and right in front of us while he stroked himself more rapidly. God, that's good, he purred in his best porno movie voice. At that moment, I noticed movement in the darkness around the far end of the flat, the end from which Willie Marino had left the warehouse. "Slow it down, slow it down, slow it down." Jeff gave up all pretense of a tune as he got more into himself. The figure stepped from the darkness at the edge of the flat and came into the light behind and a little to the left of Durkin, and carrying with it a short piece of metal pipe. It was my mother. I hoped that I didn't look as astonished as I was for fear that Durkin would open his eyes and realize that something was wrong. But I didn't need to worry. He continued his routine and repeated, "Slow, slow, slow it down." At this, Mother lowered the boom. "Glad to oblige," she said as Durkin dropped to the floor. "You do know the most charming people," she said to me with a cluck of her tongue. "My God, you've knocked him out," I exclaimed stupidly. Mother curled her lip at me. "Did you want me to wait till he finished his performance?" "For God's sake, what are you doing here?" I said. "Honestly, look at the two of you," said Mother as she laid down the bit of pipe and crossed behind us. As she began to untie me, she added, "It isn't safe to let you walk the streets alone, is it?" "What are you doing here?" I said more sternly. "I followed you, of course," she replied matter-of-factly. "It wasn't hard, and even if I'd lost you, I still knew where you were going. I watched you talk to the conserje, then asked her where you'd gone. Not that I should be unhappy to see you under the circumstances, but it's far too dangerous for you here." Mother nodded her head, and I could see over my shoulder that her face was dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I can see it's too dangerous for me." "Will you just untie us?" I snapped. "There's a little bit of a hurry-up involved here," said Peter. "Since at the moment we have a rogue FBI agent here searching the place for a guy from the mob. We heard him come in." "Oh, you mean the door," Mother said in her primmest Mary Poppins voice. "That wasn't the mob coming in. That was me going out." "What?" Peter and I said in unison. "I told you I followed you here. I got up to the end of that shelf over there just about the time they were tying you up. When you started telling him about Willie Marino being onto him. By the way, that was an inspired bit on your part." "Thank you," I said dazedly. "Anyway, I thought it best to stir things up a little, at least to distract him long enough to get you the hell out of here. So I went back to the back door and made sure I closed it loud enough to be heard. I felt sure he'd investigate, then I just nipped around the outside to the front door, slipped in, and here I am." "Are you out of your bloody mind?" I said. "Well, it worked, didn't it?" "But you could have gotten yourself killed." "And you most definitely would have been killed if I hadn't done something." "Do you think," said Peter crisply, "that you could possibly postpone this family squabble until you've untied me?" "Oh," said Mother, coloring slightly. "So sorry." And in another moment, she had him free. "We've got to get out of here. Holmes is wandering the aisles with a gun. It's not going to take him long to decide to come back here." I turned to Mother and added, "Do you have a gun?" "I didn't pack a rod this trip, darling. I didn't think you'd need firearms to get Patrick out of the movies. I suggest we head out through the door I came in." A low groan emanated from the inert form of Jeff Durkin as we tiptoed past him and around the far corner of the flats. There was a fairly dark space past which lay a short hallway. One side was the outer wall, the other an office with semi-opaque glass windows. At the end of the hallway to one side was the front door to the warehouse, the door we'd bypassed when we arrived, in favor of the more obscure entry in the back. Mother came to an abrupt halt at the door with Peter and myself slamming into her like an extremely mismatched version of the Three Stooges. She shot a withering glance over her shoulder at the two of us, then as quietly as she could, opened the door crack. She peered through the opening at the dusty twilight and uttered an, "Oh, Lord." Peter and I squeezed in beside her to look. Derek Holmes was standing in the middle of the open area between the warehouses, looking from side to side. It appeared as if he'd just about satisfied himself that nobody had come into the warehouse and was trying to figure out where whoever had closed the back door had gone so quickly. Just before we shut the door, Holmes wheeled around and headed back toward the warehouse. He stopped in his tracks when he saw that the door was ajar, and after a brief pause, hurled himself in our direction like a wild thing. letting off one shot in the process that popped through the wood just above Peter's head. "Jesus!" he exclaimed. Mother slammed the door and turned the deadbolt. I grabbed a straight-backed wooden chair from the end of the hallway and shoved it under the doorknob. I had no idea what that was supposed to do, but that's how they always secure a door in the movies. There was one split second of silence, followed by the crash of Holmes' body hurtling against the barred door. An unmistakable splintering noise assured us that, locks and chairs notwithstanding, Holmes would be with us in a matter of moments. "This is not a good situation," she said, sweeping to the side of the door in case Holmes should let off another shot. "Let's get the hell out of here," I said, and the three of us ran for the back door. Even in my panic, I managed to notice that Jeff Durkin had rolled up into a fetal position, a pool of some unmentionable-looking mass lying beside his head. He had apparently roused just long enough to vomit before returning to his unconscious state. We fled down the far aisle toward the sideways shelves that bisected the room. Just as we were about to round the corner, there was a subdued rumble as the front door shattered and our pursuer tumbled in. I grabbed Mother by the arm to stop her and held a finger to my lips. Peter stopped just short of running into us again. There was no further sound, but I swear to God I could feel Holmes's presence in the building. Staying perfectly still, you could almost sense the stale air of the warehouse shifting around him as he approached. From the look on Mother's face, I could tell I wasn't the only one who developed this sense. She whispered sternly, "Okay, quickly and quietly," as she led us around the shelves and down the aisle to the back door. When we reached it, I grabbed the doorknob and turned it, but the door held fast. Holmes had locked it. Peter said, "Look," and pointed to the lock. My stomach dribbled down into my shoes when I saw why Holmes had been so intent on breaking through the door in front. This particular lock was the type that requires the key to unlock it from either side, and since it opened inward, it would be a hell of a lot more difficult for us to break out than it had been for Holmes to break in. We were trapped, and he knew it. "Ah, shit," said Mother, her choice of expletives serving as a sure sign the situation was truly dire. Mother doesn't swear easily. At that moment, a shot rang out from the opposite end of the warehouse. The three of us looked at each other, and I imagined that the expression on my face showed the same amount of shock as on theirs. "Split up," said Mother. "Wait," I cried as quietly as I could. "It's the only way," she countered. She slipped down one aisle, and with a nod at me, Peter slipped down another. In horror movies, the heroes always make the mistake of splitting up, and that's what gets them all killed. But Mother's logic was unmistakable. Staying together made us sitting ducks, but Holmes couldn't be in three places at once, so our chances of finding some way to immobilize or evade him were higher if we were apart. Mother had gone left, and Peter went right. I stood plastered against the end of the middle row of shelves, trying to decide which way I should go. I didn't relish the idea of starting down an aisle only to find myself face to face with a man with a gun, with the nearest crossway several yards off. The fans continued their noisy hum, providing the only sound. I craned my neck around the corner of the shelves and felt only slightly relieved to find the aisle empty. Now, I knew one place Holmes wasn't, but still had no idea where he was, or from where he might emerge. I crossed the aisle, sticking to the back of the shelves, and glanced down the aisle just to the left of center. It was also empty, so I decided to take my chance. I walked as quickly as I could without making any noise. I was about 2 yards from the first cross space when I heard another shot. My heart lodged in my throat. I plastered myself against the shelves as someone ran along the bisecting row. It was a moment before I realized that the brief flash of material I'd seen streak across the space was my mother, and that moment that she at least had made at half the length of the building, but the sound of the shot and the speed of her retreat indicated that Holmes was in hot pursuit. I knew I had to distract him, and a quick glance at the shelf I was pressing against gave me an idea. I shoved a box back through the shelf. It pushed against a box on the other side, which hesitated only a moment before slipping off and dropping to the floor of the center aisle. I tried to flatten myself against the shelves again in a desperate attempt to disappear into them, while staring down toward the opening. I'd seen Mother race across. Holmes came just into view, gun in hand, as the box fell. The noise stopped him in his tracks. Instantly, he wheeled back and started down the aisle behind mine. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it caught in my throat when I realized that Holmes would surely know almost at once that the crate had been pushed from my side. I charged for the back end of the row, desperately to get out of this aisle before Holmes reached the cross space. I almost made it. Just as I reached the corner, a shot rang out and pinged against the corner of the shelves. I didn't even bother to glance back, remembering the lesson learned through repeated viewings of Chariots of Fire. If you look back at your pursuer, you lose time. Unfortunately, this left me with a dilemma. I didn't know whether Holmes would continue down the aisle or opt for a crossway. Neither way looked good for me. In trying to distract him from Mother, I cornered myself. I stayed pressed against the end of the shelf so that I couldn't be seen, but it wouldn't take him long to figure out what had happened to me. I agonized about which way to go with the heightened desperation of a hunted animal. Suddenly there was a loud crash in the aisle down which Peter had run. I was surprised at first, and it hit me. Peter and Mother must have gotten on to how I distracted Holmes and were now doing the same. I took the opportunity to glance down the aisles on either side of the shelving unit. Holmes had continued down the aisle in which I'd fled. Unfortunately for me, he appeared to have caught on to the purpose behind the crash and wasn't going to fall for it again. But it had startled him enough that he was looking the other way when I glanced around the corner, and I managed to race to another aisle before he turned his head. I knew now, or at least believed, that Peter and Mother had managed to get past the raving FBI agent, which was at least some consolation. However, I was still trapped in the back half of the warehouse, near the door that required a key. Even if Mother and Peter made it out the front door, they still wouldn't be able to open this one to free me. With Holmes knowing my approximate whereabouts, it would be difficult for me to get by him without being seen through the shelves. It would only be a matter of time before Holmes had me, unless I came up with something, or Peter and Mother found some way to come to my rescue. That's when I had the brainstorm that demonstrated for once and all that I'd lost my reason. Throwing aside the one hard and fast rule Agent Lawrence Nelson had taught me for avoiding pursuit, never go up, I decided my best bet for eluding Holmes was to try to scale the shelves. If I could reach the top without creating a lot of noise, hoping that any noise would be masked by the steadily droning fans, Holmes just might believe that I'd somehow managed to get past him. I gripped the highest shelf I could reach, lifted a foot up to get a hold of one below, and began to climb carefully, pushing the pornographic debris away from the edges as I went to ensure that I didn't make the mistake of knocking anything to the floor. There was less than an inch of ridge bordering each shelf, which made my sweating hand slide precariously with each grasp, seriously cutting into my hold and my confidence. With each new shelf as I climbed the metal network that spanned to within a few feet of the ceiling, my hands gripped and slid on the metal. My body was uncomfortably arched in the center, the shelves between my hands and feet jutting into my stomach as I tried to balance myself. I had achieved the halfway point when, with my next step, the shelf cracked and bent beneath my feet. I hoped the noise wasn't really as loud as it sounded to me. I held my position for a moment, and the fans seemed to hesitate in their revolutions, as if holding their breath in anticipation of my being found out. At that point, I didn't think there was anything, other than my sagging strength, to keep me from continuing the climb. I passed shelves of cartons and crates of tapes, and rubber and plastic implements that had marital aids tattooed on the side. I was getting dizzy from the exertion and panic when my right hand finally reached the top shelf. I reached as far across it as I could, while my legs continued the rest of the way up. I was just about to swing my legs up when a shot rang out and a hole popped through the top shelf, about 3 inches from my head. "Fuck!" I said under my breath, though the low tones were no longer necessary since it was obvious that Holmes knew where I was. I lay stock still against the heavily painted metal of the shelf, silently breathing in the heavy dust that had settled there and cursing myself for not having listened to Nelson. I raised my head enough to see the lay of the land. There was a veritable sea of shelf tops, close enough to make it possible to jump from one to the other, but far enough apart to make doing so dangerous. I thought I could manage the jump even without being able to stand fully erect, but I knew I couldn't do it quietly. And then there was the possibility that if I miscalculated, I would go straight to the cement floor. Whatever I did, I had to do it fast, because although Holmes had paused in his shooting, I could be pretty sure he hadn't stopped. I decided the best thing for me to do was to slide myself forward as far from my current position as possible, along the shelf before jumping. I thought that would at least confuse Holmes as to my location. Though the shelf top was littered with crates, I was pretty sure I could get around them without being seen. I slid forward, trying not to make a sound, realizing that this was the first dusting this thing had ever received. I had gone a few feet when another shot rang out and another hole popped through the shelf in between my ankles. Sweat was now pouring from my forehead, turning the dust to mud as I pulled myself along faster. In my mind's eye, I could see Holmes way down the ground, staring up at the shelf, trying to detect any movement. When I'd gotten to the next section of the shelf, I drew up my knees and rotated onto my feet into a crouching position. I stayed that way for a moment, eyes closed, trying to stir up my courage to leap to the next set of shelves. Finally, I decided it was now or never. I opened my eyes and my heart ground to a halt. A pair of hands were approaching over the top of the opposite shelves. In a blind panic, I glanced behind me at the shelf top against the wall. Unfortunately, it was only half as wide of the one I was on, and I was sure if I tried to jump and grab hold of it, that would be the last thing I ever did. I was just short of letting out a terrified scream when Peter's head popped over the top of the shelf. The force of the relieved air escaping from me was almost enough to knock me off my perch. Peter hoisted himself onto his shelf, smiling and waving at me as if we were meeting at the beach. We launched into an argument held in pantomime. If anyone had happened upon us, they would have thought they were seeing a movie whose soundtrack had snapped. "What the fuck are you doing up here?" I mouthed. "Confusion!" His lips moved back at me as he bared his arms. "What?" "Confusion. Mother's gone for help. We have to keep him busy." He pointed down toward the floor. "Watch." Without another word, I should say without moving his lips again, Peter leaped across from his shelf to the next so that he was one row over from me. I realized at once that he was doing after giving Holmes what I thought was enough time to react. I peeked over the side of my shelf into the aisle behind me. It had worked. Holmes had heard the noise and realized there was something wrong with it. He edged his way around the corner of the cross space. I could almost read his thoughts as he hesitated. He was wondering why the noise had come from such an odd distance. With a slight shake of his head, he continued through the cross spaces, and when he just about reached the bottom of the row on which Peter was now crouched, I pushed a crate off the shelf, and it went crashing down to the floor. I bounced back and forth against the shelving as it went. Holmes wheeled around and let off a shot without thinking. Peter looked across the expanse of shelves at me and raised his eyebrows. He had managed to get further down his row, and when the noise of the falling crate had stopped and Holmes was beginning to retrace his steps, Peter jumped to the next row of shelves. Holmes stopped in his tracks, and I drew back just before his head turned up in my direction. "I know you're up there," he bellowed, his voice sounding odd and disjointed at the increased volume. No shit, I thought. "You know you can't get away from me." Peter waved at me and pointed to the shelf on which he crouched. He was indicating a large cardboard box. He smiled and pushed it off the shelf. Below, another shot rang out, and I thought I heard it ping against metal just before one of the overhead lights shattered, sending shards of glass flying in a flurry of sparks that burst like a skyrocket and fluttered down. I felt a sudden pain and grabbed my left arm. Red beads sprouted in a line and spread on till they formed a stripe of blood beneath my hand. A shard of glass had grazed me as it flew by. I glanced over at Peter, whose concern was evident on his face. I mouthed, "I'm okay," at him, and he sighed in relief. After a moment of silence, Peter and I seemed to realize simultaneously that there was a curious scurrying around coming from below, accompanied by the unmistakable clamor of boxes being pulled from the shelves. Peter gestured toward the cross space at the end of my row of shelves. As carefully as I could, I slid over, inched to the edge, and looked down. I knew in one alarming moment exactly what Holmes was doing. He had apparently gotten the idea from the brief burst of sparks from the light bulb. He was spreading magazines and cardboards around the bottom of the shelves. He was building a bonfire. I could feel how stunned my face looked. I turned back in, Peter and mouth across the expanse. "Joan of Arc!" Peter's eyes widened and his lips moved. I didn't even have to guess what he'd say. I could already smell the smoke. Holmes had hit on the perfect plan for getting us. If we came down, we'd be shot. If we stayed here, we'd be cooked. I'd been right when I told Mother that whoever had murdered the porn stars was spinning out of control. I wasn't sure that Holmes realized that whatever happened to us, he was probably cooked too. I had to believe this place was stuffed with cartons, printed material, videotapes, and crates, all highly flammable material that would burn down in a matter of minutes. And if that didn't kill Holmes, the mom surely would. That's when it hit me. The crates, though they were outnumbered by the cardboard cartons, there was still a few wooden crates up here atop the shelves. The crates marked marital aids. The closest was on the next shelf. I leaped over, got behind the crate, and pushed Holmes. Had heard the movement and let off another shot, but I managed to get the crate over the edge without being hit. It crashed to the ground, missing Holmes by a mile. I looked at Peter, whose eyebrows were raised in question, and with the worst attempt at sign language you could imagine, tried to get my ideal across to him. Somehow he got it. Rather than trying to elude Holmes, we needed to draw him to us. Peter leaped to another shelf with a clamor. His foot slipped as he caught the shelf, and for just a moment I thought he might slide off to his death. We had more than 2 ways to die in this fiasco, but he righted himself in time and pulled his way onto the shelf. He was now 2 aisles away from me. From where I was, I could see Holmes slink through the cross space, his California-clad frame backlit by the flames. It made him look like Satan on a vacation. I jumped to the next shelf, so I was directly across the aisle from Peter, and I pulled back out of sight just as Holmes whirled around in my direction, his face upturned. At that moment, Peter pushed a crate off his shelf, and with an unfortunate amount of noise, it fell to the ground. Holmes got out of its way in plenty of time. He laughed out loud, and we could still hear him chuckling as he started to light another fire beneath Peter's shelves. I looked at Peter and shook my head. There was no way we'd be able to get a crate to fall fast enough to hit the crazed FBI agent before he got out of the way. Peter shrugged and grimaced, indicating that we didn't exactly have a lot of options here. There was one crate a few feet behind me, and with the reluctance of someone who had realized he's chasing smoke, I got behind it and pushed it as quietly as I could toward the cross space on the ground below. Holmes was tossing more debris on the fire with so much glee, I almost expected him to cackle. I was just about to push the crate over the edge when I thought I saw a slight movement at the far end of my row. At floor level, when the building was bisected, I narrowed my eyes and peered in the direction of the movement and finally made out the figure of my mother. She glanced at the arson-bent form of Holmes. Then her eyes found me, and she appeared to take in the whole idyll at once. She turned a palm up to me, signaling that I should wait a moment. There was a sound of flame sparks popping upward as they were spread by the huge fans, and the sound of the fans themselves. I held my breath. Then Mother looked up at me and nodded. I pushed the crate over the edge. Just as I pushed, Mother yelled, "Hey!" at the very top of her lungs. Holmes jumped up, wheeled around, and let off a shot in her direction. As she disappeared around a corner, that moment was enough to distract him from the noise overhead. It wasn't until the last minute that he seemed to sense the movement. His face snapped upward right at the moment that the crate made contact, and he crumpled beneath the crate, which burst open on impact, sending its contents, a bevy of oversized dildos, cascading in every direction like a shower of obscene worms. "I guess he's fucked," said Peter. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.